everybody, welcome to another episode of Cross Border Talks, possibly your favorite show on international relations and social issues. Today we are going to discuss an issue which many of you is perhaps experiencing on your own skin. That is the housing crisis in Europe. Nobody can deny actually that a lack of affordable housing became a problem in most of countries of the European Union, as well as other countries in Europe that are not yet the part of the community. Today we are going to discuss this question and the possible solutions to the housing crisis with Tobias Schweiger, who is the head of the network of the European left, and also a member of the Communist Party of Austria, which has actually some experience with dealing with housing problems on regional, local level. So this won't be just another show in which left-wing oriented people present good solutions that do not work anywhere. This will be possibly a place where we actually share some ideas about how to solve housing crisis in our local communities. And I want to welcome Tobias on the show. Hello, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, nice having me.
And I also introduce my colleague, the co-host of today's episode, Vladimir Mitev, the Bulgarian journalist. I'm Małgorzata Kulbaczewska-Figat, connecting with you from Katowice, Poland. And at this point, I also wanted to encourage everybody to subscribe to Cross Border Talks on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to us, not to miss any episode. And now I pass the floor to Vladimir to ask the first question.
Yes, let us start first with a little bit more general question, given that Tobias is on this housing network of the European left. So what are the problems which have been observed within the housing networks on EU level, and what solutions are implemented or promoted by the network?
Well, if you look on the housing question, it differs quite a lot, covering different countries in Europe. We discussed the big separation between renter market housing countries like Germany, Austria, where many people depend on renting for the housing, and we differed between countries which are buyer-oriented markets, and like Portugal, Spain, and so on, where people rely on buying houses or flats to have a house or a roof above the head. That's maybe the first difference. But of course, when we look deeper into this question, we have already found many more differences, like the situation in former Soviet countries, the Eastern countries, where there's also a different situation, even though some problems are quite the same as in other countries. So we observed the problem that maybe the most famous campaign within Central Europe, the Deutsche Wohnen und Eigen-Kampagne, which relies a lot on renting flats and make renting flats affordable again in Berlin, is not the solution for a pan-European campaign or a pan-European solution for the housing question, since renting is just in some parts of Europe the major or most important form for our people, for our voters, to solve their housing questions. And so we discussed that there is at least the thing that we need to implement rent caps where they make a lot of sense, or we have to fight for rent caps where they make a lot of sense. But we also have to address the question that people suffering from the mortgages which they have invested in their houses, which they cannot pay back, and to have their solutions like a cap or a cut of mortgages as well. So we need to address this question when we wanted to address it all over Europe in a more specific and diverse way. But we also found that there are linkages between those politics or those problems and the politics we want to address, with which we want to address, that are also able to establish linkages between these European problems.
Okay, and if you said we need to be more specific, let us have a look at Austria, so the country with which you have the most experience, and let us have a look at both negative and positive practices in Austria. For Austria used to be a role model for Austria, and particularly the Red Vienna used to be the role model for social-oriented housing policies. And I wanted to ask you how much is left of the Red Vienna today, and what are the more modern experiences of the Communist Party of Austria with implementing pro-social oriented housing policies? We know that the Communist Party of Austria is ruling the second largest city in Austria, that's Graz, when you won elections thanks to your housing engagement. And I think the viewers would be happy to find out more about the experience.
Yes, maybe it's interesting for the European public that Austria is also a very separated country in itself when it comes to the question of housing and renting. We have like a percentage of 80% renters within Vienna, the capital of Austria. So 80% of the people which are living here are relying on rents. In other regions of Austria, it's just 20%. So there is a big difference within Austria as well, whether renting is the major problem or also buying houses is the problem. But we can see that the most dense, or the regions where the most people live are the regions where renting is most important. When we come to the question of Red Vienna, this also makes an interesting point, because when you see that the city of Vienna still owns more than 200,000 flats as the city itself, not counting all the flats which were built with state money, with public money, so therefore have also limitations within the rent prices. We have the city of Vienna as one of the largest owner of flats all over the world. So this also makes a big difference also in the development of rent prices. But what we have seen in Austria is that in the last 15 years, since 2000 or 16 now, since 2006, the rents all over Austria have doubled in numbers, so they rose about 100%. And the prices within the larger cities are exploding, are getting more and more similar with other major cities in Europe, which were always the big counterpart when we said Austria or Vienna is the city where everything in housing is better than everywhere else. I think the situation is already gone, and some years before us, we will have the same situation than in other major cities in Europe. So the situation got worse in the last 15 years a lot. I think this is an experience many countries made after the financial crisis, when the international capital moved the money in investment goods like houses and flats, and the prices of buying a flat are extraordinary, and it's quite impossible for most people to buy a flat nowadays. So this is the situation we are challenging to come to the question of practices within Austria and the Communist Party. After the Red Vienna, which was between the two world wars, there was still a tradition in Vienna to build a lot of public houses, public flats. Therefore, we have this large number of public houses in Vienna, which was built in the 20s, 30s, then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the 90s, basically, the building stopped or was a lot less, and then it stopped completely. Nowadays, they try to give us the impression they build new public flats, but the numbers are completely irrelevant for the situation within Vienna's housing market. Another instrument which was then more and more pushed the was instrument that the building of houses and flats was funded by state money, which led to houses which are privately owned but limited in their prices of rents. But they had at least entry fees, which are for many people quite high or too high. So these houses, which are also large in number, are a solution for the middle classes, but not for lower class people. And I think then we can come to the point what the success of the Communist Party, especially in Graz, meant. Of course, there were quite practical solutions. You have to imagine that the public houses or the public flats in Graz were not having own bathrooms. So the communist, the member of the local parliament worked on that many years that he was able to give the public renters own bathrooms in their flats. But then I think even more important thing is that the Communist Party in Graz established a practice when people have problems with their rent, like they cannot pay it or they have a problem with their landlords, they can come to the Communist Party. They can call a number and they get a time slot when they can come, and they get support. They get a little bit of money when it's when it's important, because when they cannot pay something, they have to pay urgently, and there is no other way they can get this money. Then the members of our parliaments give a lot of their supposed income to give this money for social service. And I think this combination of quite a practical solution for a really quite easy solvable problem, and the practice of being really close to the problems of the people, giving advice, giving support, giving financial support if needed, led to a big community around the Communist Party in Graz, which allowed them to communicate and to establish trust within the population in Graz, the people. And I think this model is something which has not yet widely spread across Austria, but we are trying to establish it in different cities nowadays, and we have quite a lot of success with that.
Okay, you mentioned a number of local solutions in Austria. On the basis of your experience from your country and internationally, should housing issues be resolved rather on local level, or should they be somehow resolved on pan-EU level through the tools of the European Union?
I think you cannot answer this question in this fashion, because first of all, problems need to be solved. On which level, I basically don't care. But when we look at the problems, it's quite clear that we have to solve it on all levels, similar or in parallel. Because on the one hand, the European laws don't forbid, but make it a lot more difficult for countries and cities to build public houses. It's not foreseen or not intention of the European Union to make it easy for countries and cities to build communal houses. Therefore, We have legal problems on European level, the question of financing all this stuff. We have the question of international markets of houses, investment questions. We have the question of the international trusts like Vonovia, or Airbnb, and therefore, of course, there is a lot to do on a European level. We have a lot to do on a national level when it comes to the question of financing the projects of communal houses. But we also have these questions which can be solved on a local level, because all these questions, of course, are questions of power and of interest. And as it was said in the beginning, when we don't want to talk about solutions which could work everywhere but aren't established nowhere, we have to ask ourselves, how is the questions of housing linked to the power of left-wing parties? Is there a way to gain influence and power within society to make these big solutions happen? And therefore, the way which the Communist Party in Graz went ahead and we are trying to follow or to broaden that way, is that we link the very concrete questions and problems of people on a local level with more and more bigger questions which address a national level, which address the European level.
Okay, and as an observer of the housing policies in Europe, you mentioned an interesting thing, how housing question is connected to the left-wing parties and their electoral power. However, left-wing parties are ruling only in a minority of countries of Europe, and the tendency is not very favorable for them. So I wanted us to have a look for a moment on the second side of the political scene. Do you see on the right side any willingness to resolve housing question, or these right-wing parties are still, I won't say unaware, but rather indifferent to the crisis? Are they going to lead us to catastrophe without even thinking of the millions of voters? Or do you see any ideas for affordable housing on the right side?
Well, I think you have to differ between the different groups on the right-wing side, right? I mean, the major proponents or the major parties in the interest of the larger capital or the larger bourgeoisie, of course, they don't have interests to solve this problem. They will fight against any restrictions of the housing market, of the renting market, because they are governing for the people who profit by these problems. On the more far right side, on the fascist side, on the, let's say, national social side, on the way, we have the experience in Austria that the far right party like the FPÖ, which was in government sometimes in the last 20 years, is separated within itself. They have this strategy to get strong in public houses. They really also are very present there. They talk to the people. They also try to have concrete solutions for problems of them, but always in the scheme of their racist perspective on society. So their bigger solution is kick the foreigners out, so we have enough affordable houses for our people. There is always this racist, fascist master frame which they have in the background or in the foreground. But of course, they address these questions. I mean, it's quite clear that the rights, social populist parties address also the problem that international capital is streaming into the national housing market make it unaffordable for many people to buy houses or at least flats, and therefore they agitate quite aggressively sometimes against that. But when it comes to the real question of the social distribution, they have another problem, because I think, at least in Vienna, you can see it. They, on the one side, they want to continue the social dimension of public housing, as I already said, in a racist perspective, but they want to do that. On the other side, the Red Vienna is still one of the reasons why social democracy is like inseparable of the Viennese city and the Viennese city government. Therefore, they always need to address a hatred against the city government, against the bureaucracy of the city, and therefore have also the intention to go aggressively against the administration of the public houses. Therefore, they are not clear and don't get really a good grip on this question in a coherent way. But you can see, and I think Austria is not the only example, that far-right parties can gain some influence or trust by this question as well. But most of the time we have to see that the linkages between these parties and at least some industrial interests, some capital interests are very strong. Therefore, the answers they can give are most of the time not coherent to the solutions they propose or they agitate for.
Okay. In the last question of today's show, I wanted to invite you to look a little bit beyond the housing question in itself and look at the question of capitalist city or a crisis of capitalist city. As the German Die Linke expert on urbanism, Katalin Genburg, in another interview with us, declared that the whole concept of an accumulation-oriented, a capitalist city, has reached its limits. And when we are thinking about new housing policies, we also need to think about more affordable cities, cities better for living. And her idea was to have perhaps large cities, but divided into neighborhoods with all the basic services available at a close range. What are your thoughts on affordable or welcoming city?
Yeah, you mean the question like in my utopian perspective or my political goals, or?
That's your choice.
Well, of course, it would be the perfectly fine solution to have larger cities where housing is affordable, where public transport is for free or very affordable and very widely spread and established. So therefore, you don't need a car and so on and so on. That, I mean, that's of course that's the fact, and I think that's a picture we, as a left, can also paint. The main question might be if the people trust us that we can make progress to such a future. And I think people are basically right not to trust the left, because I think we all over Europe showed them a lot of times that we let them down, that we have not the strength within society to really make progress in a coherent way between the perspectives we propose or we promise and the solutions we make happen. Therefore, I think we have to be also a bit, how do you say? I think we have to be limited in the promises we make, because of course there are quite concrete solutions, right? We could force every new house which is built can be built in a way that it does not imply costs for heating or for energy. We could force the companies which build houses, or we can make public companies happen which build houses, which imply no energy costs, because it's just a must that the house produces the energy itself, which is needed for people to live in it. That's a very concrete solution, which we can legally make happen when we have the power to do that. The main question I think we should really address is whether or not we are able to get in the position to do that. Of course, utopian pictures or the promise of a better future is a part of getting stronger, but the question of organizing, of involving people, of making individual problems the problem of us all, find solutions as good as we can on an individual level when needed, strengthen the perspective of individuals to fight again together against the things they suffering. That's seems to me the more important question, also on a European level. I think, to be honest, when it's the place also to say that we have the problem on European level that we always talk a lot about pictures we want to have, and not a lot how like a new internationalist perspective can be established. What would it really mean to have pan-European fights for affordable housing? How could organization together fighting on all these levels together, how could that look like? What would that need to have? What would it mean for all the parties within Europe? How have they to change? Which linkages between the European civil societies need to be established? Is there a strategy behind it? Is there a tactic for that? Are there people willing on a European level to do that? All these questions seem, for me at least, more important than the question of this pretty picture, which of course I can paint for you as most of us could.
Okay, we are looking forward for more discussions on housing issues, including with people from Southeastern Europe. And we would like to thank for your presence, and I hope it's been an interesting talk for our listeners.
I think that for the listeners, it will be really interesting to find out how the things are addressed in Austria when things are going on indeed. And I think that it could also be an inspiration to answer the questions that were posed at the end. So how can we organize on international level? For there are housing movements everywhere in Europe, weaker or stronger. And perhaps the big question for all of us is how to link our forces, how to unite, and how to be as efficient as the second side of the political debate. So far, they were imposing their solutions on the housing market. Now it is time for us. Thank you very much for being with us, Tobias. Thank you, Vladimir, for co-hosting this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Cross Border Talks, and see you again.